right, friends. We are going to get started. It's on. Can you hear me or no? Not well. Trey? I don't know that I can. Is that better? Okay. Folks, welcome. I have a little bit of logistics to address. That is the rain. So I can't fix that. I'm sorry. But so what that means is we are planning. We've moved the afternoon's information tables. We were supposed to be outside with the ice cream truck and all of that. Ice cream truck is still coming. It will be in front of Mackay. I will not take the soft ice cream away from anyone. It's one of my childhood favorites. But anyways, but the information table, so the folks who represent our centers and some of the initiatives, we're not going to make them stand in the rain or potential rain. They will be in the main lounge set up in there. So I hope you'll take your ice cream and go back in and mill around and take a look at what's happening at Princeton Seminary. There's a really wonderful, rich offerings through all of the different centers and grant projects and continuing education and such. So I hope you'll go in and meet those good people. The other thing is we do still have a walking tour of Princeton at 3 o'clock. So I just wanted a show of hands who's still willing to go walk Princeton with an umbrella. And I have umbrellas for you so you can represent while you're walking through town. Okay? So what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to, after the luncheon, after you get your ice cream, you want to go into the main lounge, and one of our student workers or one of my colleagues will be there with Princeton Seminary umbrella for you to take with you on your walking tour, all right? I don't have enough for everyone, or I would hand them out now, but I have enough for the walkers. So that is, those are my logistics for the morning. One more. The Angle organ concert this evening, your schedule says it's in the chapel, which is half true. If you go tonight, you'll hear both organs that the seminary has. It's going to begin in the Gambrel room, which is in Scheide Hall, right next to the chapel, and then everyone will move to the seminary chapel and continue the concert there. So it's a moving concert tonight. Martin wanted me to make sure you knew that. So here at Princeton Seminary, there are those who will want to argue about what is the heart of an institution of higher education. I'm in the camp that believes that it is the faculty that are the heart of the institution. I've been an administrator for a very long time. I think what I do is very important, but I think much of what I do supports the deep research and teaching that happens amongst the faculty, and I am constantly amazed. They all have gifts and skills that I do not have, and I'm so, so grateful for them. So this particular hour at Reunion is my favorite because I get to show you the wonderful people I get to see all the time here at Princeton Seminary. I'm going to guess that every single person in this room could identify 1 or 2 or 3 or more faculty members you had, professors you had while you were here, who had a deep and profound impact on you and your faith formation and your formation as a pastor or a leader in the world. So today, this is my way I want to say thank you to these 6, and an additional, we have a guest faculty person here too, who said yes to my invitation to come and speak with you this morning. They will each get about 7 minutes to talk about a passion project of theirs. Either I ask them to draw from a recent book publication, their research, or a course that they normally teach here at the seminary. And after you listen, you're going to want to go to all of the workshops afterwards. But that's not possible. You're going to have to pick one. And they will be, one of them will be in here. Your schedule tells you where they are. 4 are downstairs and 1 across the hall in Stewart 5. So it's my pleasure now to just mention quickly, we'll come up in the order that I'm going to say your names. So first will be Ken Appold, the James Hastings Nichols Professor of Reformation History, followed by Dr. Keri Day, the Elmer J. Homerkhausen Professor of Constructive Theology and African American Religion, Dr. Mary Farag, Associate Professor of Early Christian Studies, Dr. Mark Taylor, the Maxwell M. Upson Professor of Theology and Culture, Dr. Elaine James, Associate Professor of Old Testament, and Dr. Gordon Mikoski, Associate Professor of Christian Education, with his friend Marcel Sass, who is Professor for Practical Theology and Religious Education at Philipps University, Marburg, Germany. Please give them a warm welcome. Ken, you're up.
Thank you very much, Dale. Thank you, all of you, for coming today. When did my 7 minutes start? Now? Somebody told me the ideal sermon is 8 minutes, but we only get 7. I guess that kind of shows you where the hierarchy works. There's currently a Netflix series that I discovered about 2 days ago of historical documentaries called Turning Point. Exactly 500 years ago, almost to the day, there was a turning point in Christian history, and in the history of the Protestant Reformation in particular. It was the year 1525. It came about through a massive peasant uprising in Germany, one of the biggest such revolts in European history. It's not included in the Netflix series, at least not yet. But it was at least as consequential, if not more, than the turning points they did include. What happened? For at least a century, Germany's peasants had suffered terrible exploitation at the hands of their landlords. Their taxes were raised to the point of threatening their survival, and the lords extorted them into greater and greater bondage, imprisoning and torturing them at will. Finally, in 1525, the peasants had had enough. Inspired by the teachings of Luther, Zwingli, and other reformers, they demanded justice. In their view, the authorities were no longer acting according to God's law. Banding together in groups of more than 10,000 at a time, the peasants renounced their feudal oaths, formed what they called Christian unions, and marched through the countryside calling for a more Christian society. The authorities' reaction was swift and brutal. Using professional soldiers, the German lords massacred the peasants. By June of 1525, more than 100,000 peasants lay dead in the fields. In parts of Germany, half the adult male population had been slaughtered. In one case, more than 18,000 women and children who surrendered to the Duke of Lorraine were hacked to death on a single afternoon. The revolt ended. The surviving peasants returned to their feudal estates and lives of bondage, and in many cases remained in that condition until 1918. How did the Protestant reformers react? While many local rural clergy supported the peasants, and some even lost their lives during the conflict, the Reformation's leaders condemned the peasants and their cause. Martin Luther went even further, calling for the peasants to be killed, quote, like mad dogs, end of quote. Luther's lack of sympathy for the peasants has become infamous in church history and is, along with his writings against Jews, one of the darkest moments of his career. And yet, Luther was one of the winners in this conflict, and it was his Reformation vision that carried the day, won the support of the establishment, and has shaped Protestant culture to the present. Now, it's easy in retrospect to critique Luther on moral grounds. He was clearly wrong. And yet, because his arguments prevailed and his agenda proved formative for Protestant culture, we, who inherited that culture, need to do more than pass quick moral judgment. We also need to try to understand the conflict between the reformers and the peasants more deeply, and to recognize how its long-term legacy still reverberates in our churches today. Luther viewed the peasants as a threat to the Reformation, and in that sense, he was at least partly right. This was, above all, a religious conflict. Although the peasants' cries for justice gave their movement a political tone, and this is indeed how most historians have seen them, it quickly became clear that their social vision was profoundly religious and anchored in a popular form of rural medieval piety. Their language was also religious, using terms such as Christian brotherhood and love, divine law, and even the gospel. It was this last term that alarmed Luther. He accused them of misunderstanding the gospel and of slandering it. For Luther, the gospel was tied to justification, the news that God forgives sinners purely by grace and not because of their merits or works. It was a radically interior and personal spirituality, traits he shared with other reformers such as the humanist Erasmus, as well as Zwingli and Calvin. It was also a very learned spirituality, a faith drawn from intensive study of Scripture and long periods of introspection. It was a faith communicated by words and concepts. And here, Luther notices that the peasants are misusing those concepts. That should not be a surprise. Almost all the peasants were illiterate. They couldn't read or write, and they didn't know a lot about the concepts that Luther valued so highly. That's not how they learned about religion. People who cannot read, people who don't have a lot of free time for introspection and personal meditation or abstract discussion, acquire their religious knowledge in different ways. They learn not just with their minds, but also with their bodies. Scholars have a term for this. We call it embodied cognition. Applied to the 16th century peasants, it allows us to reconstruct their religious worldview by examining the kinds of impulses they derive from their physical environments, such as the land, and from their ritual lives. These rituals were passed on from generation to generation and often experienced communally. They did not require accompanying texts. They worked just fine without a lot of words. In church, they experienced baptism and the Eucharist. At home, they received blessings from the priests, sprinkled holy water on their crops, and participated in the rich assortment of feasts and fasts that marked the liturgical year. That ritual life allowed them to experience God as benevolent, as protective, and above all, as one who gave the world peace. None of this was apparent to Luther, who showed no understanding for these traditional processes of theological learning. His was a different world, the world of books and words. Nothing the peasants believed would have contradicted what Luther found in those theological books, and most of what Luther taught would have resonated with the peasants. But those conversations never happened, and therein lies the great tragedy of this turning point in history. Deprived of its broad foundation in the embodied learning of the rural people, Protestantism became a one-sidedly intellectualized religion of the learned elites. And that's a legacy we cope with even today as we hurl more and more words at fewer and fewer people. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Again, my name is Keri. I teach constructive theology and African American religion here. Just to give you a sense of sort of the courses that I teach, it spans anywhere from constructive theology to political theology, the area of Christian ethics, and all of that engaging sort of the rich scholarly traditions of African American theology and African American religion. So with that being said, I am really excited to be facilitating this seminar today, A Curious History of Pentecost. And I wanted to start by briefly saying that I am a child of Pentecostalism, Black Pentecostalism. I grew up in the Church of God in Christ. The acronym is known as COGIC. It's actually the largest Black Pentecostal denomination in the United States. My great-grandfather was one of the 21 founders of Brown Street Church of God in Christ in Springfield, Illinois. That's central Illinois. Right after the Azusa Revival, that church was founded in 1921. And it's actually the mother church of the Kojic churches there in Springfield. And my father actually is pastoring that church today. Has been pastoring for 25 years. I say all of that for a reason, to give you sort of my own narrative and what connects me to a recent book that I've written. It's published in 2022 entitled Azusa Reimagined, a Radical Vision of Religious and Democratic Belonging. And in this particular book, I'm sort of making the argument that Azusa, and I should say here that the Azusa Street Revival of 1906 began on the streets of Los Angeles, California. It is sort of known as that revival that sort of birthed really most of our mainline Pentecostal denominations in the U.S. And arguably, some might say, is quite significant in global Pentecostalism abroad, okay? So with that being said, I wrote a book on the Azusa Street Revival, and I argued that its liturgical life, as well as its social practices, can be understood as a direct critique to the racial capitalism of the day at the turn of the 20th century, right? And this is really important because in some of the literature on religious history, as well as definitely within Christian theology, Azusa, as well as much of Pentecostalism, is sort of treated as a footnote of American religious history, and it's not seen as sort of a very robust resource in the doing of Christian theology. It's seen as something that is sort of secondary, right, or ancillary. And so part of what I sought to do in this book is to recenter why Azusa is important to Christian history, to American religious history within the context of the United States, but more specifically as a way of arguing that Azusa should not be interpreted as apolitical, as otherworldly, as compensatory, right, as withdrawn from society, but actually at the beginning of the 20th century, where you have a major racially segregative ethos, right, that is a part of our country, undergirds our country, as well as the rise of industrialism that is sort of funded by racial logics. I mean, this is after the emancipation, but the failure of Reconstruction on the heels of Plessy versus Ferguson, where you have Jim Crow laws that are being birthed, that you have Azusa between that sort of emerging. So with that being said, there are three guiding questions that you will come and we'll investigate together as a part of the seminar. The first question is, were Christian communities the only communities appropriating the language of Pentecost at the start of the 20th century? You would assume that if anyone's appropriating the language of Pentecost, it would be Christian communities, right? Period. At least that's what I assumed as I began researching this book. And I was pleasantly surprised as I turned to historical research in the archive to discover that there was some really unlikely and some unsavory characters that were appropriating the language of Pentecost. What if I were to tell you that business tycoons were seeking to appropriate the language of Pentecost at the beginning of the 20th century? I'm not going to tell you anymore. We're going to talk about that, okay? And lay the groundwork, right, at the beginning of the 20th century for other communities that were appropriating Pentecost. And this is important because you're better able to see Azusa's vision, right, of Pentecost as a kind of countercultural witness grounded in the gospel mandate according to the ministry, the death, and the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And so that's the first question that we're going to be exploring together. What other communities were appropriating the language of Pentecost? The second question, how did Azusa's religious life resist the racial capitalism of the day? I just said sort of broadly their liturgical life and their social practices. We're going to delve into certain practices that Azusa had, such as tarrying, which is sort of seen as a descendant of the ring shout. Now, what's interesting is that as Azusa's happening, where you have whites and blacks and immigrants and all kinds of people at Azusa, you equally have many white evangelical ministers that are coming to Azusa, and they are essentially saying that Azusa does not reflect Christian faith. It does not reflect Protestantism. In fact, at least for these ministers that are coming down, such as Charles Parham and the evangelist Alma White, they're saying that actually what we're finding down at Azusa in terms of religious practices would be akin to the pagan African retentions that we see on slave plantations. So part of this question is also getting at, in the life of Christian communities, that is globally, certainly in the United States, what constitutes Christian identity, right? What constitutes Christian belief and practice? The question of doctrine and practice were so central to this revival. So tearing, as well as their social practices, the newsletter they had, we'll talk about how their newsletter, the way that it operated within their own church economy in many ways that defied the market logic of the day. So those was a couple examples. So again, that second question, how did Azusa's religious life resist the racial capitalism of the day? We'll be exploring that. And the final question, what might Azusa teach us theologically in our current political moment about how Christian communities might incarnate the countercultural witness that the gospel demands? And so while the book that I wrote is fairly historical, it's probably the most historiographical I've been on any particular book, it's asking the question, what does that mean in this particular political moment, by sort of marked by anxiety and fear? And I talk about the way in which this community embodied a political moodiness about the democratic structures of the day that promised equality and justice and fairness for all. But somehow that particular promise was undercut, right, by the realities as such. So these are the three questions that will guide the seminar, and I look forward to seeing you if you decide to come.
2025 marks a major anniversary for the history of theology. Not only 500 years since the Peasant Wars, the revolts, but it's been 1,700 years since the Council of Nicaea in 325, 1,700 years of Nicene faith. So it seems fitting to begin with a quote from the greatest proponent of Nicene faith, Athanasius of Alexandria. Athanasius famously wrote, "God became human so that we might become God." Athanasius expressed the same theology of salvation with another pithy line, "Wonder at the word's philanthropy, that for our sake he is undignified, so we may become dignified." This line captures succinctly the heart of theologies of mercy in the early church. Wonder at the word's philanthropy, that for our sake he is undignified, so we may become dignified. The greatest philanthropist, the Word of God, showed us what true philanthropy entails. True philanthropy is a path through undignity to bring about dignity. Practicing mercy or being a philanthropist demands utter humility if it is truly going to honor the innate dignity of the downtrodden. What is this humility? Though we are all born kings in the image of God, we cannot voluntarily be born in a manger or voluntarily be led to the slaughter as a dumb lamb. So what can God's humility look like for us? Gregory Nazianzen, another 4th century theologian and proponent of Nicene faith, offers an answer in a speech called On Loving the Poor. Gregory overturns the power dynamic seemingly inherent in practices of mercy or philanthropy. The practitioner of mercy typically has more power, wealth, and status than the one receiving the mercy. The one who has bread has power and even wields that power in handing bread over to the one who has none. What is the humility, the undignity that overturns this power dynamic? It's to do two things: to recognize our own woundedness and need of mercy, and to live truly by Matthew 25. Whatever you did to the least of these, you did to me. The recipient of mercy is Christ to the practitioner. Practitioners are to see in themselves wounds, to long for a cure, and to seek the cure by regarding the recipients as Christ, the all-powerful God. So the practitioner, in fact, is the infinitely weaker party approaching the infinitely stronger, the powerless party approaching the all-powerful God, the needy one begging for help. Gregory Nazianzen expresses this most clearly at the end of his speech on loving the poor. He says to those who recognize their spiritual wounds, to approach the healer Christ through practices of mercy. Through these genuine encounters with Christ, our wounds as practitioners will be healed. To use Gregory's words, quote, approach the healer, pray to him, heal your wounds through his, acquire like through like, or rather, be cured of things greater by things lesser. He will say to your soul, I am your deliverance, and your faith has made you well, and see, you are well. And all his words of compassion, provided he sees you compassionate towards those in pain, unquote. We are cured of things greater by things lesser. The lesser thing is to give to the needy. The greater thing that we receive as practitioners is the encounter with Christ and thereby the healing of our souls. At the outset of his speech, Gregory goes through a long litany of fine things: faith, hope, love, zeal, self-restraint, quiet, and so on and so on. He lands at the end with mercy and says, of all things, nothing so serves God as mercy, because no other thing is more proper to God. Combined with Athanasius' well-known line, God became human so that we might become God. God became human to show us what mercy is, and for us to become God means becoming merciful. In fact, Christ commands us, be merciful, just as your Father is merciful. The early church is best known for its great theologians like Athanasius of Alexandria and Gregory Nazianzen, but in fact, theologies of mercy were more often conveyed through storytelling. And I'd like to describe two stories briefly. Both of them are unsettling, and both are about unnamed rich men. The first is about no mercy, the second is about all mercy. The first comes from the Gospel of Luke, the parable of Lazarus and the rich man. Believe it or not, this parable was the first scripture to come to the minds of the ancients when asked about mercy. The unnamed rich man spends his whole life in luxury and ignoring the poor man Lazarus at his gate. When he dies and finds himself in torment, but Lazarus in the bosom of Abraham, he begs for mercy. But in asking for mercy, he betrays, But in asking for mercy, he betrays a most distorted understanding of what mercy is. He does not say, have mercy on me and forgive me for believing myself to be whole, in need of no cure, and for my neglect of Lazarus. No. He says, have mercy on me and send Lazarus to serve me. Being in torment has taught him nothing. He still treats Lazarus as someone beneath his status who ought to be serving him. This is a story about someone who completely fails to understand mercy. He never encounters Christ because he failed to see Christ and Lazarus at his gate, and still failed to see Christ and Lazarus even when Lazarus was in Abraham's bosom. He failed to see Lazarus' dignity and adamantly refused to humble himself, even in the midst of torment. The second story was written in Syriac about the man of God. The unnamed character in this story is the son of the richest Romans. His parents are about to have him married, but he escapes. He gives up the marriage and all his rights to his parents' enormous wealth. Instead, he chooses to live as a poor man among the poor. That's all he does, be poor among the poor. His way of life among the poor is very ascetic, prayerful, and indeed merciful. He only keeps the alms he truly needs and distributes his surplus to all his fellow poor. This way of life proves inspiring to others, like the custodian of the church where he begs and the bishop of the city. His little acts of mercy produce great acts of mercy in others. One might critique Gregory Nazianzen for overturning the power dynamic between practitioner and recipient in perception only, not reality. We are to perceive Christ in the recipient, all the while remaining powerful by worldly measures of wealth and status. The story of the man of God overturns the power dynamic in reality. The rich man becomes poor. His actual identification with the poor and life with the poor are what make him a saint worthy of a story. It's not clear whether the man of God was a historical figure or whether the story is a contemporary retelling of the incarnation. Either way, the story is unsettling. Why didn't the rich son wait to inherit all his parents' wealth and use it to materially support the poor? Isn't this bad stewardship of wealth simply to give it all up? What good do we do to add ourselves to the increasing number of the poor? The trouble is that all these very same questions could be posed of Christ. Why didn't Christ just reallocate all the wealth? Wasn't it bad stewardship on Christ's part to give up all his riches and honor and be born a humble, poor human? What good did Christ do to add himself to the ranks of the humans? Wonder at the words philanthropy, that for our sake he is undignified, so we may become dignified. The man of God became undignified, and in the story, all the poor around him become dignified as a result. And this is celebrated as great, inspiring, true philanthropy. For the seminar, I'll have copies of the man of God story to read together and discuss.
Good morning. As usual, I have to do some political history to get to the theology that I plan to address in my talk on Christians, U.S. empire, and genocide in Gaza. After centuries of racially rationalized settler colonialism against native lands and peoples, after centuries of chattel slavery and expansionist drives of racial capitalism stretching across the Pacific and south into the Americas, after dropping 2 atomic bombs to end World War II, and after insisting that the dollar be the world's currency of exchange, after all this, and just 3 years after World War II in 1948, George Kennan, head of the U.S. Department of State Planning, wrote a secret memo, and he stated this, it's now declassified, quote, "We have about 50% of the world's wealth, but only 6.3% of its population. We cannot fail to be the object of envy and resentment. Our real task is to maintain this position of disparity. We need not deceive ourselves that we can afford today the luxury of altruism and world benefaction. We should cease to talk about human rights, raising living standards, and democratization," close quote. Call this the U.S.-American imperial attitude. Soon after, covertly or overtly, and indeed without sentimentality, the U.S. instigated coups and subverted democracies in more places than I have time to name here. As the Cold War ended in the 1990s, U.S. imperial agendas persisted, with a Pentagon plan announcing in 1992 that, quote, "Our first objective is to prevent the emergence of a new rival," end quote. Then, after having bombed and invaded Panama, the U.S. unleashed 2 imperial wars in the Gulf region against Iraq and maintained a 20-year war in Afghanistan, ending in 21. It was in this post-World War II era also that Israel became a key ally in the U.S. imperial agenda. Just prior to Israel's receiving statehood in 1948, some 300,000 Palestinians were subject to massacre and expulsion by Israel. In a second stage, and after more occasional massacres and war against surrounding Arab nations, another 400,000 were dispossessed. Israel's later war in 1967 against Arab nations enabled Israel to occupy still more land. All the while, billions of U.S. dollars flowed to make Israel ever stronger, in spite of international laws ruling that Israel's occupation was illegal. But Israel's technologies of occupation increasingly serviced U.S. imperial designs. So Israel became what Israeli anthropologist Jeff Halper describes as a key enabler of the West's U.S.-led imperial hegemony. More recently, the first Trump presidency, and Biden too later, promoted the Abraham Accords, seeking an alliance between Israel and Arab neighbors, particularly with Saudi Arabia. This was to create a kind of Middle East NATO, as one said, termed normalization. It was designed to serve global North interests against China's incursions into the region. This normalized alliance would create a U.S.-controlled entity at the crossroads of 2 lucrative investment corridors. One lucrative trade running from west to east into Asia, another one from the global north through the Gulf region into Africa in order to secure minerals and natural resources, many of these essential for powering digital and electrical technologies. So, when Palestinians and their supporters resist U.S.-funded Israeli onslaught in Gaza today, they are impeding also this empire building and its interests. Israel needs Gaza and Palestine as laboratories for developing its military and surveillance technology in order to remain the militarized partner needed by the U.S. and its allies. In fact, the genocidal assault on Gaza itself has become a necessary thing to empire, so profitable it now is, especially for its weapons manufacturers. We can talk about the genocide word in seminar if you like. After the October 7th attacks by Hamas and others, when war crimes against Israeli citizens were committed, Israel unleashed a wildly disproportionate response, dropping on crowded Gaza tons of mostly US-made bombs, roughly equivalent to the 2 nuclear bombs dropped in Japan. After 6 months, it had dropped 70,000 tons on Gaza, more than the tonnage dropped in World War II on London, Dresden, and Hamburg combined. Meanwhile, the number of those slain exceeds 60,000 and is still rising. Israel now is preventing all aid from entering Gaza. Israeli professors at times speak even of the need for extermination, not just the military. Our tax-funded US-made bombs continue to fall. London School of Economics senior fellow Jason Hickel argues that for capitalism and empire, this is no moral problem, but a political one. Genocide serves imperial designs, as it often has many times in the past. I want to start a conversation at our seminar on why this is both a moral and a theological problem. Today, empire is stoking anew, as you know, flames of nationalism, seeking our loyalty for its armies abroad unquestioningly. It glorifies money and power, bristling if you question corporations, those guardians of the most gilded of US gilded ages. And so any counter-imperialist faith and theology becomes a kind of rebellion. If it is done for Gaza, well, the Trump regime's Project Esther labels you anti-Semitic or a Hamas supporter, and you live in fear of being removed from your country or worse. So for Christians, the first question might be, what is that famous phrase and verse about? Perfect love casts out fear. Can it withstand the fear stoked by empire's despots today? Further, is there an intelligent understanding of the resurrection which, following the spare lines of the Gospel of Mark's resurrection story, understands following Jesus as a going back to Galilee, that place of restless struggle for life amid empire? And what is this cross upon which Christians confess Jesus died? Was it not an imperial execution, since death by crucifixion was primarily for political upstarts and obstructors? What if this is a political, historical torture death meant to remove those who were inconvenient to empire? And what kind of life is possible after that? And more concretely, is there any counter-imperial power available for us among our beliefs now, enabling us to stand against an empire that brutally implements its political economy by genocidal violence? In many places, it does this. But now, quite obviously, in Gaza, with so direct and enormous a supply of US aid. Dare we dream this kind of counter-imperial power for ourselves and for others? Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. It's an honor to be here with you. That's me, Elaine James. It's an honor to be here with my colleagues. I don't know about all of you, but I will be attending all of the seminars. They sound wonderful. This morning, I want to talk a little bit about aesthetics and the Bible. So the common sense of aesthetics is, of course, the beautiful, usually referring to beautiful objects, especially works of art. In the 20th century, aesthetics has been pretty much synonymous with philosophy of art. But this is problematic for thinking about the ancient context, as I like to do as an Old Testament scholar. In the ancient context, art as a distinctive category doesn't quite exist. There aren't any museums, for example, as we think about them. Moreover, the art approach excludes certain types of experiences, especially experiences of daily life, especially women's experiences. So there are two thinkers who can help us explore ancient aesthetics. The first is modern 20th century philosopher John Dewey, and the second is ancient, the Hellenistic philosopher from the first centuries BCE, Kohelet, our unknown author of the book of Ecclesiastes. So first, John Dewey. In Dewey's Art as Experience from his 1931 lectures, let's see if I can make my slide go here. Dewey critiques what he calls the museum conception of art. Art is not about exceptional objects in exceptional spaces. Instead, we might think of art as experiences that intensify and enhance the ordinary sense perceptions and meaning of daily life. Dewey insists that art is not separate from craft. High forms of aesthetics are not separate from low ones. Both forms of making contribute to rich, meaningful, lived experiences for us. This stream of thinking helps us to account for the variety of ways that people produce and experience aesthetic effects in an array of realms. He writes this: in order to understand the aesthetic in its ultimate and approved forms, and here he's thinking of the high arts, one must begin with it in the raw. The sources of art in human experience will be learned by him who sees how the tense grace of the ball player infects the onlooking crowd, who notes the delight of the housewife in tending her plants. Notice, Dewey's writing in 1931. You can hear his sort of 20th century experience. And yet I want to call attention here to the fact that Dewey points to women's work as a source of aesthetic experience, the delight of a housewife in tending her plants. As I will argue, an approach that takes everyday experience seriously as a site of aesthetics, as a site of meaning-making, will help us to account for women's aesthetic experiences, which are almost completely invisible to us otherwise in the ancient world. So our second thinker is the elusive Kohelet, the unknown and unnamed author of the book of Ecclesiastes. I suggest that Kohelet, too, is a philosopher who's thinking about aesthetics, about the meaning of rich sensory experience. The concern of this book is finding meaning in the encounters of our daily sensual lives. What the eye sees is one of the central themes of the whole book. So how can Kohelet think about women's work? Well, as we know, the central domains of women's work in ancient Israel, as we all know and think about all the time, I'm sure, the central domains of women's work in ancient Israel are related to household and body. These include textile production, making fabrics, the bearing and rearing of children, the daily production of food, and musical composition and oral performance. These domains leave little or no trace in the material record. They are ephemeral. Women's work is ephemeral. While archaeologists have noted certain paucities of evidence for women's cultural lives, the discipline's emphasis on the material record, what objects remain that we can find, has meant that we don't have much reflection on ephemerality itself as a characteristic of women's cultural contributions in ancient contexts. We have little knowledge of women's aesthetic experiences because they literally disappear. They biodegrade. They float away on the air as music does. What happens if we take this ephemerality itself seriously? Now, here's where I think Kohelet can help us, because Kohelet is our great theorist of ephemera, hevel, vapor, what vanishes. The aesthetics of women's work and the ephemeral arts of the everyday are for Kohelet a center of value. The collagist, Kohelet means the person who gathers together. This is often translated the preacher for gathering together people. But what if Kohelet is an artist too, gathering together ideas and phrases, an artist himself? The collagist celebrates work that is ephemeral, especially textiles and food. My argument builds on Jennifer Kusid's observation that while the implied author and audience of Kohelet are both masculine, in some ways Kohelet is an enormously masculine book, The seeds of certain feminist perspectives are also present in the valuing of the body's experience and the pleasures found in the domestic sphere. Kohelet is interested in exactly the ephemerality of lived experience. Some 26 times in the book, Kohelet says it is hevel, vanity. Havel havelim, vanity of vanities is how the book opens. That's the NRSV's translation, by the way. I think we might better translate it breath, breath of breath, vapor of vapor, ephemeral of ephemerality. Consider this. Go eat your bread with joy and drink your wine with a light heart, for God is already happy with your work. I mean, we could just stop there and linger with this beautiful wisdom. At every moment, let your garments be white and oil never lacking on your head. Enjoy life with the person, in this case, the woman that you love, all the days of your temporary life. You could translate this. This is literally your hevel life, your breath life, that are given you under the sun, because that is your portion in life and your work at which you work under the sun. Here, it is food, drink, fabric, and women that are the source of lived experience, the center of aesthetic value. If you're interested in these questions about women in the ancient context, about aesthetics in general, or this perplexing book of Ecclesiastes, we will have the chance to see how these ideas play out in the last poem in Ecclesiastes 12. In this closing poem in chapter 12, ephemerality, I think, is valorized as Kohelet presents us with this haunting meditation on the ephemeral work of women. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm Gordon Mikoski, and I teach practical theology in the mode of educational ministry. I'm also a Presbyterian minister, and I have one foot in the academy, one in the church. My wife is a Presbyterian minister, and I do whatever she tells me at church. And I'm also working at the intersection of theory and practice.
Good morning. It's a pleasure being here since I've been kind of voluntold to be here. But it's a pleasure. I'm not a graduate from Princeton Seminary, but I teach practical theology and religious education at Phillips University in Marburg. Though today a state public university with 16 public schools and more than 20,000 students, we are the oldest Protestant university in the world, founded 1527, and an intellectual movement of the Reformation that links pretty close to what Ken Appold did earlier. So that's my university, and I happen to be a Lutheran minister.
So today we're going to start by talking about we're all facing problems in the church. Decline in every category. If you look at Pew Research data, every single category of religion in America is in decline. This was before the pandemic. The pandemic just accelerated those problems, and we're still dealing with those problems. It's not really good news that religion, and this is not just North America, also in Western Europe, religion is in decline. We do still face challenges that arose from the pandemic, decline in physical attendance. The money was pretty good during the pandemic, but now it's begun to decline. Volunteering is down. We have aging clergy, aging congregations, at least in the main line, and the rise of the nuns, not N-U-N, but N-O-N-E, the fastest growing religious dynamic in American life, and I think probably in Germany at least as well. People who say, I'm not really connected to religion. So on top of all that, we have artificial intelligence that's taking over more and more of our lives, often for good. I'm not totally against it, but also it's creating stress and problems. And if you extrapolate a little bit into the future, it's going to impact the life of the church and the work of ministry in ways that we have to think carefully about. I wrote an editorial for Theology Today recently with the title, Will There Be Anything Left for Us in the Age of AI? And I think the answer is yes. And it has a lot to do with how we position ourselves for leadership in the church going forward and how we find our way forward in the midst of uncertain times. We could try to go back to the good old days, which I'm sure my historical friends would say, actually, when you look carefully, it's not that we're not that great. Every age is unique and has its own problems. We could pretend like nothing is happening. We could just give up. But we are of the mind that we should innovate and try some new things, kind of in the spirit of John Dewey, actually. So what we want to talk about is not solutions for you, but for habits of mind and skills that are needed for where we are now in order to have a constructive future for ministry and the life of the church. Innovation is going on in a lot of different fields, in medicine, in tech, in business, even in education. A lot of times people don't think of church and innovation in the same breath. But if you look carefully, again in Theology Today, I published a whole series of articles from colleagues here showing that in every one of our disciplines, innovation is a key dynamic. Biblical studies, history, theology, practical theology. What we want to talk about is innovation in theology and the life of the church and how that will help us to navigate as we interact with culture and face the challenges of our day.
So in our project, we try to develop a creative strategy, and we use a metaphor, sailing the 7 seas. That's because the two of us are port people. He's from Seattle, I'm from a little Navy town in the northwest of Germany. And we like the interplay between the human and the non-human factors when sailing, like we need skills and knowledge, of course. But there's also the sea, which is unpredictable. And the wind has its own power, or sometimes not, which would make us rowing then. So in our project, we don't provide answers about content, about innovation. We have convictions, strong ones, about the skills and mindset we need in order to navigate our challenging times. So we don't talk about what we do, we talk about how we would come to innovation. And innovation, as an American and a humble German would say, is highly contextual and often improvisational. So it requires risk-taking. And why 7 C's? Well, 7 is a lucky number. And 4 C's, we kind of borrow them from public education leaders talking about future skills, 21st century skills, or often sometimes about futures literacy. So that's caring, collaborating, critical thinking, and creating. That's the 4 skills you need in every kind of higher education as well as in elementary education. Caring, collaboration, critical thinking, and creating. We then kind of baptize these 4 C's and add 3 more C's. Changing, because we are rooted in the Reformation, in the conviction that Ecclesia semper reformanda. Church has always to be reformed. And we add comparing. So in order to understand me, I need to understand him. We need to compare different contexts. And cherishing. We use Augustine, like what's the goal of teaching? Cherish Trinity and love God. That's the goal. These C's are uniquely human and cannot easily be fully done and replicated by AI. So these 7 C's should be held by other fields. But as pastors and practical theologians, we believe that they are rooted then in an overreaching capital C. And you might guess what that capital C could be: Christ. So in order to do innovation, we acknowledge that Christ points beyond all our particular efforts to doing innovation, and that makes us innovative as well as humbled. Thank you.
We have 5 minutes to spare. That was pretty good. Thank you. We'll have a little more than a 15-minute break, so the seminars will begin at 11:15. And I now have my handy-dandy schedule, so I can tell you where you are. Ken Appold will be in Stuart 1, Keri Day in Stuart 2, Mary Farag in Stuart 3, Elaine James in Stuart 4, Gordon and Marcel in Stuart 5, and Mark Taylor will be here in Stuart 6. There should also be signs outside the doors as you're leaving. So take a break. The bathrooms are inconveniently located on the third floor and the basement of Stewart Hall. And there should be some coffee still out front. Oh, and the books, I forgot to mention the books, sorry. So we're gifting you with a book published by one of our faculty. Please take one with you. Try not to take more than one if you can. Anyone who didn't make it this morning can swing by the tent today and grab their copy, all right? Thank you so much. And after workshops, lunch is in the dining room. It'll be a plated lunch, and we will be giving the 3 alumni awards at lunch. Thank you.